Hello?
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
You're number, I think she's 4. Are you on? I don't think so. Yeah.
Okay, here we go. All right. Okay. Well, I apologize in advance for reading. I just have to because I'm not good at just talking. We at Literary Cape Ann are so happy that this day has finally arrived, and we are happy to share it with you. Thank you for being part of today's Men and Their Memoirs conversation. Before you leave, please sign up for our very occasional newsletter. And the sign-up sheets are on the 2 round tables, and please take a minute to do that. When we do usually send out a newsletter to let you know of upcoming events. My name is Ray Francor, and I'm one of 4 team members for Literary Cape Ann. Mary Riyad is right here. Carol Ann Conroy is somewhere in here. Carol Ann is right there. Diana is right there. McCloy, there you go. I want to explain how we'll spend the next hour and a half. After introductions, actor and audiobook narrator Peter Burkrot will read excerpts from each of the author's memoirs. This is Peter's 3rd presentation for us, and you'll soon see why. The authors will then speak with each other and moderator Mary Riyad about writing and publishing their critically acclaimed memoirs. Mary will invite questions from all of you. Please be concise so lots of people can participate. We'll conclude with book sales and signings. Thank you to so many who helped make this day possible, starting with the authors Steve Almond, Ben Anastas, and Andre Dubus III. They too are friends of Literary Cape Ann and have been incredibly kind and generous with their time and enthusiasm. Thank you so much to Shalin Liu Performance Center for all that this iconic venue does to make these events we have here welcoming and beautiful. And they do a lot. Thank you to Addison Choate Inn for their wonderful hospitality, to Arwen and the Bookstore of Gloucester for always selling the books, to Sun Engineering, to Bach Builders, and the Institute for Savings for their more than generous support. Without all these giving institutions, today could not have happened. I've read and published reviews of all 3 memoirs we're going to talk about today. Each reading experience was completely and deeply immersive. My heart raced, excuse the cliche. I was very often in a state of awe, and sometimes I cringed for what these men had endured and done. Their books aren't just stories. They are gifts of insight and shared revelation, hard-won and carefully processed for all of us. From a review I wrote in 2013 of the book Handling the Truth on the Writing of Memoir by National Book Award finalist Beth Kephart, I said this: although there are harsh critics of the so-called memoir glut, for instance, in the New York Times, Neil Gensingler decried this absurdly bloated genre, the numbers and the passion of memoir readers win out. Good memoirs are personal, therefore embraceable, unforgettable, instructive, enlightening, often beautifully written, and therefore literary works of art. And finally, before Peter's presentation, I'd like to introduce our panelists who have produced works both embraceable and enlightening, and whose books are, in Kephart's words, active, alert, and not lazy. Steve Almond's new novel, All the Secrets of the World, published by Zando Books, will release in April and has already been optioned by TV for 20th Century Fox. This is Steve right here. He's published a dozen books, including the New York Times bestsellers Candy Freak and Against Football. My daughter and I once drove to Portland, Maine to experience one of the best readings ever, Steve talked about Candy Freak and handed out free candy. It won me, and I've been a fan since. Today he'll be referencing his book, William Stoner and the Battle for Inner Life. Steve teaches at Harvard and Wesleyan. His stories have been published in the Best American Short Stories, Best American Mysteries, and Best American Erotica. His essays and reviews have appeared in the New York Times Magazine. Ben Anastas, at the far end of the table, is the author of the novels An Underachiever's Diary and the faithful narrative of a pastor's disappearance. His memoir, Too Good to Be True, was a national bestseller, and his short fiction has appeared in the Paris Review and Yale Review, where it was awarded the annual Smart Family Prize for Fiction. His journalism, essays, and reviews have appeared in the New Yorker, New York Times Magazine, New Republic, Harper's, and many other prestigious publications. He teaches literature and writing at Bennington College and is the fiction editor of the Bennington Review. Andre Dubus III in the middle. His 7 books include New York Times bestsellers House of Sand and Fog, The Garden of Last Days, and his memoir, Townie. His novel, Gone So Long, has been named on many best book lists, including the Boston Globe's 20 best books of 2018. His new novel, Such Kindness, will release in 2023, and his essay collection, Ghost Dogs, releases in 2024. He was a finalist for the National Book Award and has been awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship, the National Magazine Award for Fiction, 2 Pushcart Prizes, and he's a recipient of an American Academy of Arts and Letters Award in Literature. He teaches full-time at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell. Peter Berkrot has had featured roles in Candy Shack and Showtime's Brotherhood. He's appeared on America's Most Wanted and Unsolved Mysteries. You can hear his voice.
Wait a minute.
He's appeared, wait a minute. You can hear his voice on television, radio, video games, documentaries, and industrials. He's a prominent acting coach and has directed the Emmy-nominated The Truth About Cancer. He has voiced over 500 audiobooks, more than 300 for children. He's won 10 Earphones Awards and an Audie Award nomination. We are so lucky to have him reading excerpts today from each of our panelists' memoirs. And Peter, you can have my place here. Steve's book is coming out in April, as you know. And
Did we move this plant?
okay.
Raise your hands and say.
There's something happening.
And then this is Steve Almond's book, Ben's book, and Andre's book. First, 2 of these will be on sale back there, along with a whole lot of other wonderful books. Okay.
All right. Okay. If I knew she was going to mention America's Most Wanted, I would have worn a mask. Before I start, even though I'm not supposed to speak, that's sort of uncharacteristic and irresponsible of me to represent myself as someone who's really going to be invisible. I just want to say that narrating audiobooks has been, for me, the most fun I've had post-puberty. But I do want to say one thing in all sincerity. Narrating, is there feedback? I just want to make sure I hear.
We're good.
Okay. Peter. I just want to say that narrating memoirs is probably the most personal form of narration, because the narrator's job is to pretty much consume and disappear, to stay out of the way. As an author, I don't know if it would be harder to write personal stuff and then have to read it, or to listen to someone else read their memoirs. But either way, they've all suffered enough for their art. So I'm just going to jump right in. We're doing this in alphabetical order. Andre will be surprised to know that makes D last. So, welcome to the alphabet. And now seriously, enough about me. Let's see if I can sit and still. How's that? Is that okay? This is from Steve Almond's book. Is this from William Stoner in The Battle for the Inner Life? Okay, that's what she said. I was listening. And this is the opening by way of introduction. Let us now praise unfamous men. In the autumn of 1995, at the age of 28, I abandoned a career in journalism to pursue the dubious goal of writing short stories. My selection of a graduate program was eased considerably by the paucity of my talent. I applied to 20 schools, was admitted to 3, and offered financial aid by 1. A state university nestled in the polite and muggy suburbs of the South. I rented a carriage house whose central allure was a gleaming antique bathtub that seemed to portend my future. I yearned to become the sort of writer who spent hours bleeding truth onto the page before collapsing into a scalding soak. Everyone in the program dreamed the same dream. If we worked hard enough, if we read the right books, if we charmed the prevailing mentors, our work would be plucked from the slush pile, gussied up for publication, and bound into handsome volumes by the bad parents of New York City. At precisely this point, everyone who had ever rejected us would be forced to admit the terrible mistake they had made. I was particularly inept at disguising my aims, and would eventually become so reviled that the fiction faculty barred me from attending workshops and refused to read my thesis. All that comes later. I mention these circumstances only to suggest my frame of mind when I first encountered Stoner. This happened a few months into the program at a party hosted by my friend, Dan Belkin. We were getting to know one another with the help of some affable drugs when he asked if I'd ever read Stoner. I eventually discerned that he was referring to a novel, which I assumed would be a tale of hydroponic hijinks. It is not. The author, John Williams, begins. William Stoner entered the University of Missouri as a freshman in the year 1910, at the age of 19. 8 years later, during the height of World War I, he received his Doctor of Philosophy degree and accepted an instructorship at the same university where he taught until his death in 1956. He did not rise above the rank of assistant professor, and few students remembered him with any sharpness after they had taken his course. Stoner's colleagues, who held him in no particular esteem when he was alive, speak of him rarely now. To the older ones, his name is a reminder of the end that awaits them all. And to the younger ones, it is merely a sound which evokes no sense of the past, and no identity which with they... You had to use 2 W's? And to the younger ones, it is merely a sound which evokes no sense of the past and no identity with which they can associate themselves or their careers. To understand how audacious I found this opening, you would have to know how loyal I was back then to the dogma of the MFA program. The smothering exhortations to show, don't tell. Because I lacked confidence in the stories I was trying to write, because those stories were at best half-formed, I reliably plunged my readers into the consciousness of some poor schlub in the middle of some unspecified crisis. I assumed this chaos would beguile readers, that they would hunger for all the facts I withheld from them. I was writing almost entirely out of my insecurity, which explained the inflamed prose, the preposterous plot twists, and glib dialogue. It wasn't just the flat, expository style of Stoner that flummoxed me. Williams had opened his novel by dryly announcing the insignificance of his protagonist. I assumed the point of literature was to document the lives of the driven and depraved, the lawless and lust-ridden. In short, the memorable. It hadn't occurred to me that the story of every life, from a cosmic perspective, is one of obscurity. You are alive for some brief span, then you die. The great mirage of human consciousness is that our striving deeds will render us immortal. It might be said that I had confused literature with history, which serves as the de facto press office of the infamous. This confusion redounded my own ambitions. I wanted from literature to be known by the world. I had missed the point. Literature exists to help people know themselves. None of this occurred to me on that first night. I remember only that I read Stoner in a spell, and that I wept a good deal. Inexplicably, though, not unhappily. The novel's central events can be summarized in a single sentence. Stoner, the only son of subsistence farmers, attends college, unexpectedly falls in love with literature, and becomes a teacher. He endures a disastrous marriage, a prolonged academic feud, and a doomed love affair, then falls ill and dies. The book refuses to hurtle Stoner toward a traditional conception of heroism. He does not fight in a war or launch a doomed expedition. He does not ascend the ranks or vanquish his foes or risk all for love. He is often excruciatingly passive, constrained by the conventions of his age and the inhibitions of his character. Stoner enthralls precisely because it captures with unbearable fidelity the moments of internal tumult that mark every human life. It took me several years to absorb the essential lesson of Stoner, which is a precise repudiation of the idea I clung to back then. What matters is not the quality of a particular life, but the quality of attention paid to that life. I didn't realize it at the time, but this was the reason I had fled journalism in the first place. As an investigative reporter, I was expected to document the escapades of notorious scoundrels, dirty cops, con men, the whole sordid smorgasbord. My editors wanted an accretion of damning fact. But I kept pondering motive. What had possessed these people to self-destruct? The interior life is a real life, as James Baldwin observes, and the intangible dreams of people have a tangible effect on the world. This line of inquiry did not sit well with my bosses. I can still remember the reaction offered by the owner of the newspaper chain for whom I worked. He had flown into town, as he did every year, to bawl us out for insufficient zeal. These reprimands usually happened at a fancy restaurant, where we could feel guilty for dining on his corporate credit card. When I announced my departure for grad school, he glared at me for a good half-minute. "You want to write books?" he said finally. Okay. This is from Too Good to Be True by Benjamin Anastas. And it begins with, "At the church door." It took a long time for me to admit that I had failed. Even as I write this, I can feel the old machinery kicking in and sputtering. "Yeah, but you still have time." Or, "Don't worry, things will turn around." Or that old dependable excuse trotted out by the teenager in all of us, "The world just won't understand me." But I've stopped listening to my own excuses. I have reached the point in life where I no longer accept false hopes, the palliative care of counterfeit wisdom. Part of this is courage. Even more is necessity. When you have failed like I have, that is, when you've watched all of your best laid plans, one by one, fly off on their own like crazed songbirds and peel off in long, lovely arcs into the nearest picture window, then you'll understand how I ended up, one raw autumn day not too long ago, standing outside a church in Brooklyn, with my hands pressed against the doors so I could pray. In broad daylight, arms spread like I was being frisked from behind, head bowed and murmuring pleas for help in a divine power, to a divine power I wasn't even sure that I believed in. In a stalled career, sorry, I'm going to read that again because it's too good for me to screw up. How I ended up one autumn day not too long ago standing outside a church in Brooklyn with my hands pressed against the door so I could pray. In broad daylight, arms spread like I was being frisked from behind, head bowed and murmuring pleas for help to a divine power I wasn't even sure I believed in. A stalled career would be enough to get you there. I had that. A failed marriage? I had one of those too. The story of its undoing was so high drama that I should have been a sultry Argentine in a terry cloth robe, pacing my penthouse and arguing with a pre-op transsexual starlet on my product-placed mobile. The will to go on. It's not that I had lost it. No, I had never lost that, and I hope I never do. But everything I had worked for was vanishing, and my losses were mounting, and I was in need. I was in need. It's that simple. So I found myself at the doors of the church nearest to where I live, with my hands pressed against the cold exterior, asking, Lord, I need your help. Show me a way out of this. While a bus groaned up the street behind me and the sky threatened to spit rain or early snow, and my hands turned white from the cold. Nothing. I heard nothing. Just the bus. Failure thrumming in my ears. So I asked again, please, Lord, I need your help. I am lost. My life is broken. Nothing works. Can you hear me? Nothing I try is working. And again I heard no reply. Only the farting of hydraulics as the bus receded down the street. I didn't stay there much longer. It was too cold. I opened my eyes, lifted my hands from the door, and plunged my fists into the pockets of my coat to warm them up. I turned and walked away. That's where this testament begins. If you failed all the way up to the heavens, like I did that day, after failing in every possible way here on earth, the truth is the only medicine that you will tolerate, because the truth is what you need. Let's start right here. I am 41 years old, of sound mind enough. I am 41 years old, of sound enough mind, though its habits have grown soft and its defenses weak from too much time traveling on what they used to call, remember, the information superhighway. Whether on my laptop with its glowing piece of violated fruit on the lid, or the awful little slab I've made the mistake of entrusting with my phone calls and, more, my higher faculties. Plato's slab. It is the last metaphor. I can't stop touching my phone for another hit of dopamine, another fall into its time-erasing abyss. The other night, while my phone lay coldly beside my pillow, I dreamed about it. I did. The slab is always sending and receiving. I've had to stash its body deep in a utility drawer just so I could get this far. When my service contract is finally up, I'm going to drop my iPhone into an empty coffee can, fill it with wet concrete mix, let this coffin dry, then carry it to the nearest Genius bar and see what they can do with it. For too long, I have been peering into screens for messages and clues while my life went virtual on me. I don't have any time for more distractions. GPS, while it can help me find the nearest supermarket with a Coinstar machine, cannot guide me on the path to another life, cannot show me how to shrug off all the failures and repay all the debts that have brought me here. I will have to do it myself using older technology I find more reliable, simpler tools. I have something I want. I have someone I want. Actually, there's more to it. A child's bedroom that is empty on too many nights. An engagement ring I've been visiting in the boutique where it's for sale and asking the shop girls in plaid flannel to take out for me. I have a notebook in my lap, the kind you steal from the office, or buy in bulk from Staples, with a red left-hand margin, sea blue lines, and cardboard backing. As soon as this notebook is filled, I will get another from the closet. There are plenty. I have all the pens in the house I could possibly use. Over the pages that will follow, and the time they will record, I can declare my regimen of losses over and start again. I can settle into a new life that is already here and waiting. I can make my peace, even if it's sad and a little bitter, with an undoing so complete, it's hard not to step back and admire the symmetry of it. Someone else might call it the return of the repressed, or diagnose me with a case of unconscious repetition. But I see other hands at work. The evidence of an artist, the fingerprints of a master who works in mirror images. How can you explain waking up in a life that has come to resemble its earliest beginnings? That's what life wants. Symmetry. Or I can just give up. Go on screen staring. Hit refresh over and over. I can stop this notebook right where I am, file it in a box with all the others I have abandoned, and go on losing. Let's start with a little inventory. At the top, my unpaid bills. Now, this is the hardest one because I know Andre, and I didn't know to get into this if I should get into a bar fight or do push-ups or something. But I'm just going to, tense my pectorals while I read. It actually hurts. How do you do that? This is from my dear friend Andre Dubus III's memoir, Townie. And this comes toward the end of the book because it's the part about writing. One late morning, sitting alone at the desk in my motel room, I pushed aside what I'd been writing. All my staring and waiting that had brought scenes that led to other scenes. But I felt little to nothing about the people in them that I didn't... Sorry, I have to ask a question. Is that DJ Pancake or DJ? All right. Should have asked before. I pushed aside what I'd been writing. All my staring and waiting had brought scenes that led to other scenes. But I felt little to nothing about the people in them. And I didn't know why until I read The Stories of Breeze, DJ Pancake. It was clear Pancake not only knew the West Virginia hollows he was evoking so well on the page. He became the men and kids living in them. He became the men and women and kids living in them. Maybe he even loved them. And he showed this by writing in a simple, naked style that drew the reader's eye not to him, but to them. It's what I had not been doing. Somewhere along the way, I had started trying to sound like a real writer. Something I did not see myself as. A contradiction between my actions and my desire that seemed to put me in the worst possible stance for writing honestly. I was staring at myself as much as I was staring at the page. I had one eye on the mirror to see how I was doing. Years later, I would read this definition of sincerity in Nadine Gordimer's novel, A Son's Story. Sincerity is never having an idea of oneself. I was still the boy who could not bear being perceived in a certain way. A boy who'd learned to fight and get hurt, or worse, just so he would not be seen as weak. But what did being seen... See, I'm nervous. I love you. I'm scared. I'm shy. I'm very shy. You're so handsome.
I love you too, brother.
Thanks. Learned to fight and get hurt, or worse, just so he would not be seen as weak. But what did being seen have to do with writing well? It was time to start seeing. I sat at that desk feeling small and self-absorbed, and with little ability to do this one thing I felt pulled to do. But this negative self-scrutiny was just another form of insecurity. I had to disappear altogether. It took a few days or a week or longer, but I seemed to be staring at the page from a place somehow emptier than before. A place lower to the ground and more open to whatever or whoever might come. And it was an inmate, fresh out of prison and out on a date with a woman for the first time in years. He's sipping coffee, listening to her talk. Behind this moment, all those thousands and thousands of caged moments leading to this one, and he can't keep them from entering the present with this woman just inches away. Then I was going back to the joint with him, living through being new in the prison yard, having to fight to save myself, even making a name as one not to fuck with, looking out for a smaller man in my cell block, all the while counting the days till I'm free. It took 5 weeks to write a beginning, a middle, and an end. When I wrote that final passage, it was raining outside, and my breath was high in my chest, and I was tapping my foot under the desk, my hand and pencil joined together. The room was quiet. There was just my breathing and the ticking of rain against the glass. Over the next few days, I typed the story on a Black Royal typewriter I'd bought from a woman in Loveland. I'd found her through the classified ads of the newspaper and drove out to where she lived in an Airstream trailer in a brown valley in the shadow of a mountain. She had 2 typewriters to sell, both of them her father's. He'd been a journalist and war correspondent and had just died. She told me this almost cheerfully, this kind-faced woman in a smock and jeans. But when I pointed to the one I wanted, she began to cry. She shook her head and covered her mouth and apologized. She asked if $50 was too much. And I paid her, and we hugged each other as if we had both lost him. And now I was typing the last line of my story on her father's Black Royal. It was only 7 pages long. I called it Forky and drove to a copy center across from campus, made 6 copies, then mailed 5 to magazines. 1 in Boston, 3 in New York City, and 1 in Chicago. It was the first time I'd ever done that. It was like throwing a rock over a cliff and waiting to see if it would make a sound. The 6th copy I mailed to the only writers I knew, my father and his wife back east. 3 days later, there was a knock on my door. A skinny drunk who lived across from the phone booth, telling me I had a call. It was Pop. Son? Yeah. You're a writer, man. He had told me that once before, and I deflected it. Deflected the word itself. But hearing it now was different, for I felt tied only to what gave birth to that word. The writing. The sweet labor of it. And now he was talking about this new story, praising me far more than I thought it deserved. But hanging up, I was grateful for the call, for my far more experienced father to take the time to see what I was doing and say something about it. This was something he had not done much of. And as I walked down the hall to my room, there was the feeling I'd stepped into a river whose current was taking me to someplace good. 3 weeks later, I'd gotten back in the mail 4 of the stamped self-addressed envelopes I'd sent to Boston and New York City. Each of them came with a form letter. A note, really. No more than 3 lines long. Thank you for your interest in our magazine, but unfortunately this piece is not right for us. Sincerely yours. Only one of them had a name beneath that, and it came from an inked stamp, a scroll of letters I couldn't read. When the 5th one came, I didn't open it right away. It was a manila envelope with my story in it, and I felt little about this, which told me I hadn't expected much in the first place. But I knew I'd send it out again. Why not? I was done with it. I was checking my savings passbook. I had enough to gas up and drive 2,000 miles east, to stay at a cheap place along the way if I had to. But there wasn't enough for first and last month's rent once I got there, and I didn't want to crash at Pop's place, or Jeb's, or Sam and Teresa's. It was late spring, early summer. I saw myself in Boston, maybe working in a halfway house, doing some kind of good while I lived alone and taught myself to write more honestly. I wanted to find a job at night so I could write all day. Before I could leave, though, I'd have to work here longer. There were more jobs I could do for Christoph. I trailed a diamond thief for him once. A tall black man in a brown suit I followed through the streets of Denver for 2 days. I watched him walk into one jewelry store after another, trying to switch real diamonds for zircons. I'd logged what I'd seen, passed it on to Christoph, and got paid $300. I picked up the 5th manila envelope and opened it. Clipped to my manuscript was a long typewritten letter. At first I thought it was detailed criticism of why they wouldn't even think of publishing my story. But there were adjectives of praise, a few editing suggestions, and at the bottom of the page, what they, Playboy magazine, planned to pay me for this story. $2,000.
Nice.
It was hard to imagine having that much money in my pocket, but my fingers were trembling, and my feet were air, and I was running down the motel hallway to the payphone to call someone. But who? Who? I pushed a dime into the slot and pressed 0. A woman answered. She had the voice of a lover. And I asked her to make the following call: collect to this number and tell him I'll pay him back later. Tell my father I can pay every bit of it back.
Thank you, Peter, so much for doing that.
the Oscars.
Can you sneak out? Yeah, the wrong way. No envelopes, though. I have no idea how to work these mics, so if you could just test them real quickly today. I think
Yes?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Okay.
Good. All right, good.
Okay, everybody good? Okay. I think I can control the volume a little bit, but again, thank you, Peter, so much for those readings. And so I'm just I have a feeling you'll have your own conversation going, but I will be here to sort of help moderate or give some questions and then allow time for the audience to ask questions because there's a great audience here today. So sort of to begin with, in some ways your memoirs are quite different, right? But they're all edgy, beautifully written, and deeply moving. They have a lot to say about writing, and they leave us with a lot to think about, and lessons to take away. So could each of you sort of briefly describe your book and that process behind it? Loaded question, I don't know.
Hey, I'm third in the alphabet up here.
Well, you're first.
Oh, that's
Okay, all right, that happens a lot. I don't know if this is on.
No.
It
No?
should be. Let me turn it up. Try that.
Okay, can people hear me in back?
Yeah.
Okay, wow, okay, now it's frightening. So I'm supposed to describe this book. So I decided, financially, you hear all this economic anxiety. I thought, what will sell a ton of copies? How about a memoir by a mid-list author about a totally obscure novel? That will sell. That was my brilliant scheme. Short stories were already making me so much money. I thought, let me go in the direction of memoir, but not really a memoir about my personal tragedy, more a tribute to this weird book that nobody's ever heard of, but the moment they hear of it, they become entranced by it, as did I. So it was mostly an economic scheme that I was after. But also, the feeling I had, the kind of idea I had was that, and you guys, I assume, if you're here, are readers, that, and some of you are writers, my apologies and condolences, but like when you're a reader and you have a book that you love, I just read it over and over. And each time you read it, it's a different book because you're different. Your inner life is different. So when I first read Stoner, it was about, oh my God, the temple of literature and how it can rescue you from an unexamined life and ... And the next time I read it, it was about ego and academic feuds and the way that our pride gets in the way of our happiness. And then the next time I read it, it was about marriage and the rigors of marriage and how it reveals us all. We're all kind of zombies. in the presence of that much feeling and risk. And the next time I read it was about teaching, and the time after that was about failure. So that was my feeling, was that I wanted to write a book that reflected how our favorite books are manuals for living. And they help us understand how we're supposed to lead our life, and they meet us at different places in our life, and we notice different things in them. And then, of course, it's just made all this money, so I no longer have to worry anymore about, working for a living.
Thanks, Steve. Ben or Andre?
The memoir started as a lecture, right? Because I've seen this the lecture on Stoner that that's up on YouTube.
Yeah, well, that came after the book, weirdly, but yeah. I mean, it definitely, I mean, I hope it doesn't read like a lecture, but I had things to say, so yeah.
No, you can tell the difference between the two. My memoir, I've been against memoir for most of my writing life, which is due to a number of reasons. Part of it is like the memoir glut. Part of it is having had a father who was a writer who sometimes wrote about his family life in his newspaper column. I'm just kind of cranky in general. And, not as a person, but like for some reason when I sit down to write, I'm like, I just feel cranky. And it's like easier for me to be against something than for something. It's a habit I had to work very hard to get out of. So I spent like 10, 15 years being against memoir. My first novel, called An Underachiever's Diary, was sort of like an anti-memoir. I make lots of cracks about how horrible memoir is through the whole thing. But anyway, so I found myself like at this, as that first chapter described, at this really like tough point in life. I mean, I think it happens to most people. At some point, midpoint in life, things just stop working. And I thought, if I'm gonna figure my way out of this, I just have to start from very basics. And I started with these notepads and a pen. I hadn't written that way in a long time. And I didn't think at first I didn't know for sure it was going to be a book. I just thought, I'm just going to write my way out of this. And when you fail, and when like all these sort of structures you spend building over the course of a life, first as a child, and as sort of a young adult, and as an adult, and then like these means of support you build for yourself no longer work anymore. You have to think like, well, what am I gonna do now? And sort of, the only thing I really had, other than the support of friends and family, of course, but was just like a lined notebook and some pens. And so I started writing about what it was like every day to be in this position. And now I wrote the book, kind of after the big crash of 2008, 2009. So I wasn't the only person facing this. And I had come to New York after grad school, and while I never had like a full-time job in a magazine, I knew a lot of people who worked in media, and I saw that people were sort of falling off of mastheads and losing their jobs, and people who like everybody wanted to talk to at parties, like nobody wanted to see them, or like when media was retracting and anybody who failed, everyone was so afraid of failure that anyone who failed, like nobody even wanted to look at you. And so I thought, well, I'm going to write about what it's like to be one of these people who no one wants to like look at anymore. So that's how it started. And after a few months of just sort of writing this every day, I thought like this could be kind of an interesting book. But I wrote it very much in real time, every day. I did. One thing that did sort of happen as I was starting to write the book was I found a full-time job at the New York Times, which I've been looking for like months and months. So I'd wake up very early at 3:30 or 4, and I would write for an hour or two, and then I would like shower, get myself to go to work, and then I would come home. If it were days that my oldest son was with me, I would see him and make him dinner and stuff. And so it just sort of entered the rhythm of life. And at a certain point, I realized I had a book, and so I just kept on doing it.
First, Ray, thanks for having us, and Mary, and all you lovely band people, and thank you for coming, everybody. Yeah, I had a similar sort of anti-memoir feeling. I wasn't against them as a form. I just hadn't read many. I the only memoir I had read was Tobias Wolff's This Boy's Life, which, if you haven't read, is just a beautiful book, 20 years earlier. So my memoir, Tony, is a totally accidental memoir. I was not intending to write one. It sounds like you weren't either. And I love the essay form. And if you're teachers and writers, you know it comes from the French and it means to attempt or to try. And I love that about the essay. And you're attempting or trying what? To make sense of something you've been through in some way. And so I was trying to make sense of how it was that I had two sons, and we have a daughter too, and they're playing, you know, Little League baseball, and I, at age 40, did not know how to play baseball. Growing up north of Boston, in Sox country. How did I miss that boat? I did not know the first two fouls were strikes. I didn't know that you didn't have to slide into first. I didn't know that first number was the winning, how many games you won, and the second was the losing. And I was my son's coach. Because I volunteered to coach so he wouldn't be around these assholes who were yelling at little kids to score a whatever you call it. So I thought, Jesus Christ, I might write something funny for the first time in my life. So I start to write this essay, and the first scene is I say, Bobby, run, kid, go. And this 9-year-old says, Coach, he's not allowed to run. It's against the rules. Are you sure, Dick? Oh, you're out? Sorry, Bobby. I'll buy ice cream on the way home. So I start to write my way into my life, my childhood. And what came was being raised by a single mom in first world poverty in these mill towns along Merrimack Valley, being a small kid who wore glasses and used adverbs in daily speech, which made me a target, and then becoming a very violent young man. And 300 pages into it, I said, well, I guess this isn't an essay about baseball. And that's how I came about.
Well, thanks for sharing a little bit about describing that process in the book. And so now your memoirs are published, right? So what's the reaction like? Oh, I'm never doing this again. Or, wow, this has been great. And the response from people, or, wow, this has been a great experience and now it may influence your non-memoir writing. Any thoughts on that?
After you guys.
You do it again, right, Ben?
No.
Okay.
No, I'll never say never. I mean, the time may come. I mean, I think this memoir arose out of a very specific set of circumstances, and I was actually going through this divorce at the same time I was writing it, and so I sort of had to keep it secret from my soon-to-be ex-wife, and then once I finished it and decided it was going to be a book, and we found a publisher, I had to like sit down across the table with a mediator there and figure out like what was going to be in the book and what wasn't going to be in the book. It was very intense, and that was just like my ex-wife. There's also, you know, my parents, my mother and my father, and or stuff, and then I wanted to make sure that everybody was okay with kind of what was in the book, and you know, I think it was more painful for my mother than my father. My father, I think, was just really happy that I wrote about him at all.
Where's my name?
And there's stuff in the book that I thought he might find potentially embarrassing. Like there's a scene in the A&P parking lot in Gloucester where he's mooning everybody. When I was a kid, and I thought, like, this is gonna, you know, he's like a respectable person in the community. And I thought, like, this could be potentially problematic, but he was thrilled. I just think, you know, I had the image of, you know, his ass in a car window imprinted on me at a very young age. I thought I would just sort of share it. that like sky blue VW bug and your father's ass. And there it is. That's the primal scene.
Yeah, Andre's looking at me like, you pick up that one.
Top that moonshot, baby.
Right. I mean, I think what you're hearing, I'm sorry, this is going to be completely unresponsive, but here we are with Ben's father's ass, kind of hovering over us in this beautiful, misty.
Yeah, you can't leave that leaving.
Right, I can't leave that just hanging out there.
No.
But, I mean, here's my ham-handed segue, which is part of the reason that these guys are describing the process of writing the memoir as accidental, or sort of backing into it, and that I write sort of memoir on a slant. I'm always writing about my own experience, but it's, you know, in the form of a diatribe or a lamentation about football's moral corruption, or my addiction to candy and what candy says about the American sort of late model capitalism. Or this book, which does have a lot of personal stuff, but it's sort of masked behind, I'm just talking about this book I love. This isn't a look at me deal. And that's both because, understandably, one of the central battles that all these excerpts are describing is the battle against egotism. And we got two big foes here, right? Egotism and distraction. And they're really powerful allies in those little machines that Ben was talking about. They figured us out, that we're looking for some kind of regard. Notice me, world, notice me. And of course, memoir is inherently self-indulgent. Or I shouldn't say that. It has the setup for being really self-indulgent. Really good memoir is self-aware. But there are a lot of people before you get to self-aware who are just self-regarding. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, we all are, right? So the struggle is to figure out, and that's inherently feels to the writer like the wrong neighborhood to go in, because we're trying to give it to the characters and give our full attention to the characters. So there's understandable and justified skepticism about the memoir genre. And then the other thing is what Ben was talking about with his father's tushy, which is you're going to expose people you love to potentially to ridicule. Maybe they're as narcissistically well-defended as Ben's dad, more power to him. But inside of ourselves, we're telling a story which is actually telling our story is quite dangerous because it could hurt people that we love and be very disruptive. And that voice, by the way, is, you know, since it's worth noting that it's all dudes up on this panel, is even more powerful if you're a female writer or a writer from a disenfranchised community where the culture is already saying it's dangerous to speak about your experience, and it's disruptive. It's going to make people uncomfortable, and it's going to make people who you love and are trying to take care of upset at you. So that, because I think every family and our community more broadly enforces this kind of omerta, this code of silence, and that's part of what you're navigating when you're doing something as audacious as writing about your own experience. And your only thing that you can hide behind is, well, I'm trying to find the truth. I'm trying to be as self-apprehending and honest as I can. And it isn't about me being the hero of the story. It's about me being the screwed up, bewildered figure trying to find my way through the wilderness, one page at a time. But that line, you know, sounds good, but as you can hear, there's still a real struggle against saying, yeah, I wrote memoir, because it feels self-indulgent.
Yeah, and the truth that you're describing so well, Steve, is entirely subjective. You know, in This Boy's Life by Tobias Wolff, he's got this wonderful line that memory has its own story to tell, right? My brother, I have one brother and four sisters, two half-sisters I didn't grow up with, but my brother said, yeah, I like your book, but you wrote the G-rated version. I said, that's because I didn't write your memoir, man. I wrote mine. Your life was harder and darker in a lot of ways. You know, I want to bring up what they're both talking about, what Ben and Steve were talking about. The hardest part for me, I don't regret having written it. In fact, it's the one book I'm really glad I wrote for my kids. My daughter, I don't know if she's ever going to read it, but my sons have read it, and I feel they know their father a lot better, and they know where we came from. But let me back up. The word to remember, the opposite of it gives me goosebumps. It's not forget, it's dismember. Chop, chop, chop. And so the act of memory is reaching for the pieces, putting the whole back together again. And I was on a panel, the risk of the memoir, one of the many risks is becomes self-involved, advertisement for oneself. I was on this panel after having published Townie, and this woman said, I don't know why I'm up here with someone who wrote a memoir. I call them memoirs. Yeah. Right? Yeah. The hardest thing for me, and I'd like to hear from you guys too, is writing about other people. It's one thing to be able to write nakedly about your own flaws. And you know, I was turning 50 when I wrote that, so I was farther enough down the road of life. My head was probably out of my ass a little bit. I could write about myself more honestly than I could 30 years earlier. What I was not prepared for was how hard it was to write about my family. My dad had just died, and he's, you know, as you know, I'm the son of a great short story writer, a beautiful artist. He was not a real present father when I was a kid. And what I couldn't deny as I was working my way back to this childhood that came from this essay is my father's daily absence in our lives became a huge presence in the book. I didn't want it. So I left it out. I left my brother's suicidal stuff out, his sex abuse. I left out my sister's being raped. I left out a lot of darkness because I didn't want to violate their privacy. I give the manuscript to my editor. She says, well, this is interesting, all this fighting in Milltown stuff, but didn't you live with people? I said, blah, blah, blah. So that night, I want to share with you some really great advice from Richard Rousseau, the novelist. He hadn't yet written his own memoir. And I told him, I knew she was right, my editor, but I didn't know where the line was. He said, and he gave some really great advice that might help some of you if you're writing memoir. He said, I'd ask myself, am I trying to hurt anyone with this book? Am I trying to settle any scores? If the answer is yes, I'm not going to write it, or I'll write it, but I won't publish it. If the answer is no, then I'm going to write it. And as soon as he said that, I realized I was no longer angry at my parents. I no longer felt sorry for the kid I'd been. I just wanted to try to capture something what it was like to grow up in a mill town in the 70s with Nixon flying off in his helicopter and no fathers around and everyone's getting high and then I could do it. It was great advice from him. Yeah.
We're going to have time to open up to questions too. So maybe one more question. And Steve, you started to discuss, I think, but just to spiral back for 1 minute. This talk is called Men and the Memoirs, right? Which is very different, I think, than sometimes a female voice. And I think you all teach, right? You're all professors. So what does that feel like when, women want to come forward? And I know, Steve, you did start to talk about that a little bit, but what are your thoughts on that?
Amen. Amen, sisters, come on. Men have been talking for 3,000 years. It's time for us to sit down and shut up. I'm surprised we're on a panel with just men in 2022. And I'm surprised anyone came, and I'm not criticizing. This is an observation, not a criticism at all. It's just the time we're in. And
do you think men's are perceived or accepted different than women's memoirs?
I think men are used to walking around talking and not listening. And so, I don't know. I'm a feminist, baby.
I teach at Bennington College, which is formerly an all-women's college, and now it's still skewed towards women. I really don't have that many male students. I have a lot of female students, and I have a lot of non-binary students.
Yes.
So it's I'm not.
Yeah.
In some ways, it's sort of like, there's like guys in the classroom. What am I going to do? So I'm much more comfortable with sort of not teaching men, I guess. That might be kind of anomalous, but.
I just notice in classes, I mean, it's impossible not to notice that even my best students, female students, will oftentimes apologize when they're going to say something. And I just think it's drummed into us that we're living in a patriarchal system. And that means there are certain barriers to writing about your own experience, and in particular, writing about other people, because I think, again, I don't want to condemn this impulse, but I do think it is sometimes condemnable. We expect girls and women to be caretakers and to not act in a way that is angry or reckless or might be perceived as hurtful because their jobs are to go walk around mothering and taking care of. And I think that is, I think as a memoirist, person who writes about your own experience, your job is to be truthful, and sometimes that means you're going to have to say certain things, especially if you've moved through life in a woman's body, perceived by the culture, and treated a certain way by the culture in a way that is not entirely polite, and that will almost immediately get interpreted as, and we have a whole series of words for it, starting with, shrill, or whatever the various coded words are, to say you're being too honest about your experience and it's making the power structure uncomfortable. So that's just what I encounter in my classes, but I also see almost entirely that, like, if, and this is going to sound sexist, it is sexist to say, but if I have a class that has more than, say, 40% male students, it's just not as good a class. There's just too much
testosterone.
Yeah, just kind of
Yeah.
competitive competition and competitive energy. I'm not saying that sort of men have the franchise on being competitive, but just in a classroom where there's so much anxiety already and so much unspoken competition, there's something that I see as a great relief if I have maybe 60-70% female students or non-binary students, because I think everybody's starting, or most people are starting from a place of empathy and awareness.
Have you guys noticed, and again, generalizations are dangerous, but I have noticed in my nonfiction, creative nonfiction classes, whether they're writing a memoir or essay, there's the women students, the female students, who are more the biographers of their family than writing a memoir. So there's this real, I am going to speak fairly about everyone. And so this is a wonderful act of empathy. This is what's behind my mother's alcoholism and her depression. This is what's behind my father's narcissism. And I'm always finding myself in the same kind of conversation. So, you know, this is actually your time to sing. You actually have the mic now. You don't have to write about them. You can actually write your song. And I do find, to generalize it, it's usually a young woman writer I'm saying that to instead of a male.
There's a great line, sorry, Mary, there's a great line that I quote a lot of MFK Fisher. She wrote about food and lots of other things very beautifully. And she said, you know, I love writing because it granted me permission to be precise about my own experience. Which, when I say immediately the female students, I go, oh, I get to be precise about my own experience, not just have to play the role of somebody who's chronicling, which is in a way kind of another form of caretaking.
Thank you for that insight. I know it's 3, so do you mind if I steal one of the cordless mics and then you guys can share? Thank you. So I'm going to go around so that we can hear, and if there's any questions, we're going to open it up to questions right now. So does anybody have any questions? And I will go running around with the mic. You do? Okay, here we go.
Agreeably, I have not read anything of the other gentleman. But this guy in the middle,
My condolences.
everything, everything.
Oh, jeez.
I'm always interested in how place is characterized in your writing, especially in county. And I'm a North Shore person, so I was very interested in that. I'm very sorry. So could you speak to that, about the importance of place in your writing?
What's your first name?
Kathy.
Hi, Kathy. Well, thank you for that lovely comment. So, as we all know, the heart of character-driven fiction is character, and I think that the lungs is place. And then if you don't put your characters, whether it's nonfiction or fiction, into a real, living, breathing place, they literally can't breathe. They literally choke. So I use it as a way, there's a wonderful line from the writer Ron Carlson. He said, details are the instruments by which we steer. And I need to know the weather. I need to know what time of year it is. I need to know what time of day it is. I need to know where the light comes through in the room. And then once I start to get there, the characters have a heartbeat. It helps. Do you guys have a similar experience with setting?
I know there are other questions here, but I have a question I've been wanting to ask you, Andre, and it's about, your father's story, The Winter Father, about the divorced father from his point of view who's left the family. And there's that scene in the story where the older brother, he's driving off and takes the gravel and says, like, you bum. But then the same thing happens in your memoir. I'm wondering if you had that story in mind, or whether you were just thinking of the scene itself, or whether you were also kind of answering the story.
Yeah,
as you
yeah, man. So my father, if you haven't read my father's work, you're in for a treat. It's an understatement. I had totally forgotten I was in The Winter Father. I had totally forgotten. Of course, it came from life. When my father drove away, my mother was, drove away from the marriage and our lives, living with us anyway. My mother was 27. She had 4 kids under the age of 10. She had no education, no job. And we didn't have a car for a couple of days because that was the only car. I don't even know how she got a $100 car. But in real life, my little brother ran after my father. We're all crying. My mother's inside wailing like she's being stabbed. I still hear her screams. My sisters and I are standing there. I'm trying to look like a man, and I'm 8 years old and weigh 40 pounds. And my little brother, Jeb, runs after my father's car, scooping up gravel and hurling it at my father's car, yelling, "You bum, you bum, you bum." And it was it's seared into my memory, so it showed up in the memoir, but I reread Winter Father like 5 years ago, and I said, holy shit, it's in this story. I forgot. Writers, they get the material from wherever.
Stevie, okay. And I think there was a question back here. Great.
Yeah, I was just wondering, you know, the act of writing something, especially a memoir that takes is many, many pages, takes a long, long time. And a lot of it's also an act of revision, mostly an act of revision. So you get your memories down on paper, sort of. And as you're rewriting, how do you hold on to the place that you were at the beginning? I mean, I think Andre was talking about how, or no, Steve was talking about how every time you read a book, it's different. Yeah. Well, every time you read your book or reread your book, it changes, right? And so how do you hold on to the original truth? Or is that truth that comes down first the truth? Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, it's the big question. Go ahead.
She was like, I got a good response, but you go. Well, I think I understand your point, which is, you know, memory is something that's created. It's the past is filtered through the emotional and psychological needs of the present, and if that present changes, then doesn't the memory change? Is that kind of it? Yeah. And so if you start in a certain place, like Ben starts in this very dire moment, but a year later, or a year and a half, or 2 years later, as he's writing the memoir, can he still connect to the person who was out in front of that church setting his hands, right? But I think actually that the way our memories function is that they're pretty good filters, and they hang on to the core experience. So for instance, and what the memoirist has to realize is that everybody has their own radically subjective version of the truth. So nonfiction is a radically subjective version of events that objectively took place. Anytime you're creating events and inventing them, that's great, it's beautiful, it's a creative act, it's probably healing in some ways, but it also has a name for the reader, which is fiction. So for instance, the memory I have when I was, 10 years old, I was, my parents had shipped us off to Hollister for them to have a weekend, to not be driven insane. And we stayed with this woman who had all these Belgian sheepdogs in her house, and what our big activity was, we would go hit dirt clods with aluminum hammer out in the field. And I worshiped my older brother, but I also was treated fairly cruelly by him, so he was kind of this godlike figure to me who I also, underneath it all, resented. So you can see where this is going. At a certain point, I hit one of these dirt clods and hit another dirt clod, and then I was aware that my older brother was behind me, but I still swung that aluminum bat back. And I remember quite clearly that kind of spongy crack, and come on, is this glass that? Toughen up, I guess Rockport. Anyway, and I remember turning around and this, geyser of blood coming from his mouth. And I said, okay, it happens, okay? Read Townie, you'll see it happen. The point is that I remembered that, and I held on to that core memory for years, wrote many terrible mawkish poems and essays or whatever about this horrible thing I did, sent one of them to my older brother, who then said, actually, that's not how it happened at all. I walked into the path. I was warned repeatedly not to step into the path of that bat. And I stepped into that backswing. I did that because maybe I knew that I was too hard on you or something. And so what's the truth? What's the truth in that situation? The truth is the blood? The truth is the scar that he's got on his lip? And that's, I think, we tend to remember the core experience, even though we've got a certain slant on it. I'm sure in the description in that story, the dad has his memory of his, driving off and the kid throwing pebbles, but probably the version that Andre has and the version that his little brother has are different than that. But there's a core set of events that we recognize happen, that we hang on to because they mean a lot to us, even if we don't understand their full meaning yet.
I would just add quickly that it was a blessing for me to have a father who was a writer when I was working on this memoir, and there were some moments when I was writing it when we really collaborated. And I said, my memory is a little. There's actually things that happened when I was very young that I had no memory of, and my father kept a journal for most of his life, so he went back and looked at his journal pages and sort of shared journal pages with me. So I got sort of his side of, or his version, not his side, but his version of kind of what the family was going through, kind of what is divorce like for what was my parents' divorce when I was 3, which I barely remember what it was like for him. And one thing he found was actually a short story that he'd written and had sort of filed away. And then he gave me the short story, and I read the short story. And so I ended up kind of weaving the short story into that final part of the memoir, which to me was really a kind of accurate way of depicting these events they're vanished, they're somewhere long in the past. But if you can have one version of them from an old journal entry, another version of them from the story, and then another version from like interviewing my mother about it, then I have something that I can make kind of properly multi-layered and not just unitary.
I love that. There's a wonderful line from Flannery O'Connor. She says, a writer's beliefs are not what she sees, but the light by which she sees. And so off your really important question about what is truth anyway, I think for me it's got to be the emotional truth. You can't make stuff up. You got to try to get the details right. You really have to believe that what happened. But I did an NPR interview in Ohio or somewhere, and I thought it was going beautifully. The guy read the book. We had an hour-long conversation because it's NPR, and afterwards he says, yeah, I was signing. He said, hey, can you sign my book? I said, yeah. And he says, yeah, I didn't really like it. Wow, well, I'm glad you hid that from your audience. But I'm signing something sweet to him, trying not to change my mind. And I said, so how come you didn't like it? I just didn't believe there was no joy in your life growing up. And I thought about that for weeks, and I thought, there must have been. And there must have been moments of hilarity, and there must have been moments of safety. But I can't remember them. All I remember, even now sitting here at age 62, I still feel the predominant emotions of my youth, which are abject self-loathing and physical fear of getting hurt. And that's what I think the memoirist has to be loyal to, without making stuff up. Get the details right, but yeah, there was probably hilarity, there was probably joy. I don't remember much of it. So that's, again, Tobias Wolff, memory has its own story to tell.
Thank you. I think, did you have a question?
This is a very simple question and not as heavy as we've been talking about. That's the mechanics of writing, the what, where, and how. You write 24/7, 3 to 4 a.m. You write on paper, computer, or someone talked about a typewriter as well. I'm just curious. Take a few minutes and talk about it. And actually, more importantly, the end result of all that, it was what motivates you, what gets you going. Is the scenery? Do you write best in Rockport, or would you write best in your old neighborhood, on the water, or back in the city?
Well, I've got 3 kids and 2 teaching jobs, so like I write if I can, whenever I can, however I can. Ideally, it would be. I used to have these wonderful early mornings, but then I had more kids, and then like. You feel like, and then you have to get up successfully earlier to wake up before the kids do. So I would have to go back to waking up at 3:30, but I can't do that because I'm staying up until 1:30. So it's like I fit it in where I can. There's no fixed time anymore, other than just I'm sure with both of you too. Winter breaks and summer breaks. That's just like all writing all the time, but just fitting it into your life. Oh, yeah, I'm mostly doing the computer now.
these questions always, I'm not sure, but I always suspect that they're like, behind it is like, what's the process? And so we could tell you what we do and it will be disappointing. But what's really important if you have a writing practice of whatever sort is that you figure out what works best for you. I remember somebody coming to the MFA program, and he was a writer I regarded very highly. He's a really beautiful writer. And he would, he said to us in this gnomic way, you must write for at least 4 hours to immerse yourself in a state of spiritual awareness in order to produce this. And I just wrote it down in my notebook, 4 hours spiritual awareness, gotta do it. Won't get there unless it's in. I just would have that clock, and when I get to 4 hours, I'm gonna be shitting gold. And I carried that around for years, that idea, and it was just his process, and it probably wasn't even really his process, it was his rap about his process. Everybody's just totally fucking making it up, and trying to figure out where to fit the writing in. And what you should be asking is, if writing is important to you, what time. Think about the best piece you ever wrote, or the piece you're happiest with, and think about the circumstances of its composition. Think about your circadian rhythm and whether you're somebody who writes better at night or in the morning, and then try to arrange your life if it's possible. It's not always, but try to arrange your life so that those hours are available to you. Are you a coffee person or a wine person or a pot person? I don't know. I say that because, again, embedded in that question is like, what's the formula? And we don't have the formula. We have good fortune and maybe a certain amount of elbow grease, and also our good friend white patriarchal privilege to thank for having some books in the world. But the process is yours. It belongs to you, and you should do a self-inventory. If you really like writing longhand, then by all means do that. And if a computer somehow eases your path, then do it. If Scrivener helps, like I'd say to anybody, it's hard enough just to sit there and make good decisions and not condemn yourself for the bad decisions and outlast your doubt. That's hard enough. You might as well find a process that's friendly to you.
I just ask a quick question. How many here are writers? Oh, wow. Oh, okay.
I love that.
Oh.
Blackwing 602 pencils. I sharpen with the blade from my old carpentry belt. I write in meat composition notebooks in a cave in my basement I built myself, about the size of a prison cell, has no window. I face a blank wall. I read a few poems to get in the mood. As I've gotten older, I need a few more poems. And then I write by hand for a couple hours, 5 days a week, and that's my process.
Well, thank you all very, very much. This has been wonderful, and thank you so much for coming. I know that I think you're going to stick around for a little while because there's books for sale from the bookstore from Gloucester, and I know that the authors have a table back there that they'll be sitting at as well. So purchase a book if you'd like it signed, or you might have bought one of your own to have signed, or whatever. So thank you all for coming, and we do have an email sheet, and we are back in person with COVID. LCA did pivot to some online events that we were able to do, but it's nice to be back to see everyone.
Thank you all.
So thank you.
Thanks for coming out.